Abandoned in the void. The silence of space was unforgiving, broken only by the faint hum of Shara's dying escape pod. Her breaths were shallow, each one a painful reminder of the dwindling oxygen in the pod's tiny cabin. The controls flickered weakly, sparks spitting from exposed wires. She stared at the dark void through the cracked viewport, her thoughts a mix of anger, fear, and despair. Her own crew had betrayed her. They'd left her behind, jettisoned like a piece of broken equipment. She had trusted them, fought alongside them, and in return, they cast her out to save themselves. A shiver ran through her, but it wasn't just from the cold. Her species, the Laris, were resilient, but even their biology couldn't withstand the merciless void for long. Jera's fingers trembled as she tried to press the distress beacon, but the console was fried. The device sputtered, a faint beep signaling her hopeless attempt to call for help. She leaned back against the pod's cold wall, her vision growing blurry. "Is this how it ends?" She whispered in her native tongue, her voice barely audible over the faint hissing of leaking air. Far away, a small cargo ship drifted through the sector. Its captain, Eli Carter, leaned back in his chair, sipping stale coffee from a dented thermos. The ship was an old model, held together by years of patchwork repairs, but it was reliable. Eli was a loner by choice, preferring the quiet of space over the chaos of human colonies. His route was simple: pick up cargo, deliver it, and move on. As he scanned the empty expanse, his ship's radar beeped softly. Eli leaned forward, frowning. "What's this?" he muttered, adjusting the controls. A faint signal appeared on the screen, a weak, irregular pulse. It wasn't a ship, at least not a functioning one. It was barely moving, more like debris. Could be nothing, Eli thought aloud, but something gnawed at him. His instincts told him to investigate. He adjusted the thrusters and steered toward the signal. As he got closer, his ship's lights illuminated a small battered escape pod spinning slowly in the void. Eli frowned. He had seen pods like this before, usually after space battles or pirate attacks. They were grim reminders of how dangerous the galaxy could be. Most were empty, their occupants long gone. But this one, something about it felt different. He maneuvered his ship closer, engaging the magnetic grapplers to lash onto the pod. A quick scan revealed faint life signs. "Someone's alive in there," he murmured, his heartbeat quickening. Eli wasn't the heroic type, but leaving someone to die in the cold of space didn't sit right with him. He suited up and approached the pod through the airlock. The door was jammed, but after a few forceful attempts, it creaked open. Inside, the air was thin and freezing. Eli's flashlight landed on a figure slumped against the wall. She was clearly alien, her silvery blue skin and elongated features unlike anything he had seen before. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but filled with fear. She tried to move, but her body betrayed her, too weak to fight. Eli raised his hands, palms open. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, not sure if she could understand him. "I'm not going to hurt you." Jara's vision swam. The figure before her was human, a species she had been taught to distrust. Her instincts screamed at her to defend herself, but her body refused to cooperate. All she could do was watch as the human moved closer. Eli crouched down, scanning her with a handheld device. Her vitals were unstable, but she was alive. "You're in bad shape," he said, more to himself than to her. He hesitated for a moment, knowing the risk of bringing an unknown alien aboard his ship. But leaving her here wasn't an option. He gently lifted her, surprised by how light she was. Her body was cold, her breathing faint. Eli carried her back to his ship, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Once inside, he placed her on a cot and hooked her up to his limited medical supplies. The automated system beeped uncertainly, unable to fully process her alien biology. Jara's eyes opened briefly, her gaze meeting Eli's. For a moment, there was silence, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Then her lips moved, forming words Eli didn't understand. Her voice was soft, almost pleading, before she slipped back into unconsciousness. Eli sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "What have I gotten myself into?" he muttered. The galaxy was already dangerous enough without adding mysterious alien passengers to the mix. But as he looked at her fragile form, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't abandon her. Unbeknownst to them both, their fates had become entwined. Far off in the darkness, danger loomed. The same forces that had left Jara for dead were still hunting, and they wouldn't stop until their mission was complete. Fragile trust. Jara woke to the unfamiliar hum of machinery and the sterile scent of a human ship. Her instincts screamed danger, but her body refused to move. Her silvery blue skin was pale, her limbs stiff from cold and exhaustion. Slowly, her vision adjusted, and she saw him, the human. Eli sat at a nearby console, his back turned as he studied a holographic display. The dim lighting highlighted the worn-out state of his ship. It wasn't luxurious, not like the Luris vessels Jara was used to, but it was functional. The human ship smelled of engine grease and burnt coffee, a sharp contrast to the clean, floral scents of her own people's technology. Her sharp intake of breath caught his attention. Eli spun around, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "You're awake," he said, his tone calm but cautious. He held up his hands in a universal gesture of peace. "Take it easy. You're safe here." Jara's eyes narrowed. She tried to sit up but winced as a sharp pain shot through her chest. "Where?" she croaked, her voice raspy and strained. Eli hesitated, then pointed to himself and spoke slowly. "Eli, I found you. You were drifting. Your pod." He mimicked a drifting motion with his hand, hoping to bridge the language gap. Jara's gaze flicked around the room, scanning for exits, weapons, anything to defend herself. She didn't trust him. Humans were known for their greed and their willingness to exploit the weak. Her people told stories of human merchants selling faulty goods to desperate colonies and of mercenaries who raised planets for profit. But this one, he hadn't harmed her. Yet. Eli noticed her wary eyes and sighed. "Look, I get it. You don't trust me. I wouldn't either if I were in your position." He motioned to a small tray beside her, which held a nutrient pack and water. "You need to eat. Your vitals are all over the place." Jara stared at the offering but didn't touch it. Instead, she tried to speak again, her words a mix of Luris and broken galactic common. "Why? Help. Me?" Eli shrugged. "What was I supposed to do? Leave you out there to die?" He shook his head. "I've seen enough people die in space. Didn't want to add another to the list." Jara's expression softened slightly. She didn't expect such an answer. Her people believed humans were driven solely by self-interest, yet this one had risked his life to save hers. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. She gestured weakly toward the display on the wall, trying to ask about her situation. Eli seemed to understand. "You're on my ship. We're—" he glanced at the navigation screen. "We're heading to a nearby outpost. Maybe someone there knows more about your species. I've never seen anyone like you before." Jara winced, a memory flashing in her mind. Her crew, the betrayal, the hunters. Her voice cracked as she managed a single word. "Hunters." Eli frowned. "Hunters? What do you mean?" She struggled to explain, gesturing vaguely and uttering fragmented words. Eli leaned forward, trying to piece together her meaning. "You're saying someone's after you, like bounty hunters." Jara nodded weakly. "Danger. They come." Eli's face darkened. He turned back to the controls, running a quick scan of the area. Nothing showed up on the radar, but he knew better than to take that as a guarantee. Space was vast and unforgiving, and predators often moved unseen until it was too late. "All right," Eli said, his voice steady but tense. "If someone's after you, we need to be careful. My ship isn't exactly built for combat." Jara's eyes widened. She tried to sit up again, panic giving her strength. "They find us," she said, her tone urgent. Eli moved to steady her, his hands hovering awkwardly, unsure if she'd let him help. "Hey, calm down. We'll figure it out. You're safe here, for now." But Jera wasn't convinced. Her people had a saying: "The void doesn't forgive weakness, and neither do the hunters." If they were tracking her, Eli's ship would be nothing more than a floating target. Eli returned to the controls, his mind racing. He hadn't signed up for this. He was a simple cargo pilot, not a soldier or a hero. But now he was responsible for the life of a stranger, a fragile, desperate stranger who clearly carried more trouble than she let on. As he worked, Jera's eyes darted toward a nearby console. Her gaze sharpened when she recognized an interface similar to her own technology. With great effort, she reached for it, startling Eli. "Hey, what are you?" he began, but stopped as Jera's fingers danced across the keys. A hologram flickered to life, displaying a warning in her native script. Eli squinted at it, unable to read the symbols. "What does it say?" Jera's voice was barely above a whisper. "They. Close." Eli's stomach sank. He didn't know who they were, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. He looked out the viewport into the endless dark, his hand tightening on the ship's controls. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Let's see if I can keep us alive." The trust between them was fragile, built on necessity rather than understanding. But in the cold expanse of space, trust, even fragile trust, might be the only thing keeping them alive. A new battle. The silence on Eli's ship was broken by the steady hum of the engines and the faint buzz of Jera's life support system. She was still too weak to move freely, her body slowly recovering under the unfamiliar atmosphere of the human vessel. But her mind was sharp, and with every passing minute, a growing unease gripped her. They were coming. Jera sat upright on the cot, ignoring the ache in her chest. She could feel it, an invisible thread pulling her toward danger. The hunters were relentless, and she knew they would not stop until they found her. She glanced at Eli, who sat at the ship's controls, his focus split between navigating the asteroid field and keeping an eye on his radar. "You don't understand," Jera said, her voice still weak but urgent. Her galactic common was broken, but she pushed through. "They find. Always." Eli glanced over his shoulder, eyebrows raised. "I get it. They're after you. But my ship's sensors don't show anything yet." He turned back to his console, muttering under his breath, "Let's hope it stays that way." Jera shook her head. Humans, she thought, were too reliant on their technology. The hunters didn't operate like ordinary pursuers. They didn't need signals or scanners. They hunted by instinct, by the faint traces of life that other species left behind. The Lyris called them the shadows for a reason. "Not safe," Jera insisted, gripping the edge of the cot. She gestured toward the viewport, her silvery blue eyes narrowing. "They hide." Eli sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "Look, I've been flying through this sector for years. I know how to spot trouble." He tapped the radar screen. "If they're out there, we'll see them coming." As if on cue, the ship's alarm blared, a sharp, piercing sound that made both of them freeze. Eli whipped around to check the radar, his stomach sinking when he saw the red blip on the screen. It had appeared out of nowhere, closing in fast. "Son of a..." Eli started, quickly flipping switches and pulling the ship into a sharp turn. "You could have mentioned they're invisible to normal sensors." Jera gave him a pointed look, her expression somewhere between frustration and fear. "Told you." The hunter ship came into view, a sleek black vessel that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. It was unlike anything Eli had ever seen, its design alien and predatory. The ship moved with an unnatural grace, weaving through the asteroid field like a predator stalking its prey. Eli gripped the controls tightly, his pulse racing. "Okay, this is bad," he muttered. This is really, really bad. Zara forced herself to stand, leaning against the wall for support. She stared at the hunter ship, her fear momentarily overridden by determination. No, stopped, she said. Fight or die. Eli shot her a look. Fight. With what? This isn't a warship, it's a cargo hauler. The best I can do is outrun them. And even that's a long shot. Zara's gaze flicked to the navigation panel. Her people had a different way of navigating the void, one that relied on intuition and harmony with the natural flow of space. She pointed to a cluster of dense asteroids ahead. Hide. There. Eli frowned. Are you kidding me? That's a death trap. One wrong move, and we're toast. Zara's expression hardened. Better than hunted. Eli hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to avoid the asteroid cluster. But the hunter ship was gaining on them, its weapons charging. He had no choice. Gritting his teeth, he adjusted the thrusters and plunged into the asteroid field. The next few minutes were chaos. The ship weaved through narrow gaps between massive rocks, its hull groaning under the strain. Zara clung to the wall, her heart pounding as the hunter ship followed, its sleek form dodging the obstacles with terrifying precision. They're not giving up, Eli shouted, sweat dripping down his face. He glanced at Zara, his frustration boiling over. Any brilliant ideas, or are we just waiting to get blasted out of the sky? Zara's mind raced. She remembered a trick her people used in emergencies, a way to disrupt enemy sensors by creating an energy burst from the ship's core. It was risky, especially on an unfamiliar vessel, but it was their only chance. She pointed to the control panel. Overload. Core. Eli blinked. Excuse me. Overload the core. Do you want to kill us faster? Zara stepped closer, her voice firm despite her weakness. Trust me. Eli stared at her, the seconds ticking away like a countdown to their doom. Finally, he nodded. Fine. But if we die, I'm blaming you. He quickly followed her instructions, rerouting power to the ship's core. The lights flickered, and a deep hum filled the cabin, as energy built to dangerous levels. The hunter ship closed in, its weapons locking onto their position. Now, Zara shouted. Eli slammed the activation switch. A blinding burst of energy erupted from the ship, spreading in all directions. The hunter ship veered off course, its systems temporarily scrambled. The distraction gave them just enough time to dive deeper into the asteroid field, losing their pursuer in the chaos. As the ship stabilized, Eli slumped back in his seat, breathing heavily. Well, that was insane. Zara managed a faint smile, her exhaustion catching up to her. Alive, she said simply. Eli glanced at her, his expression softening. Yeah, for now. He turned back to the controls, his grip tightening. But they'll be back. We need a plan. Zara nodded, her resolve hardening. The hunters were relentless, but so was she. Together, they might just have a chance. Escape through the unknown. The silence inside the ship was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the soft ticking of cooling metal. Zara leaned heavily against the wall, her body still weak from their escape, but her mind was racing. The hunter ship had disappeared, but it wasn't gone. She knew better. They were never gone for long. Eli stood at the ship's console, his brow furrowed as he scanned the radar. The asteroid field provided temporary cover, but it also trapped them. One wrong move, and they'd be crushed. He glanced back at Zara, who was watching him with that piercing, otherworldly gaze of hers. Okay, Eli started, breaking the tense silence. We can't stay here. If we move, they'll see us. If we stay, we'll eventually run out of air. Either way, it's not looking great. Zara nodded weakly. She pointed toward the console, her voice strained but firm. Map. Eli hesitated but pulled up the holographic star map. Zara's eyes flicked over it, searching for something familiar. Her fingers trembled as she traced a route through the maze of asteroids. Finally, she tapped a faint, unmarked section of the map. "Here," she said. "Safe, for now." Eli squinted at the location. It was deep inside the asteroid field, a place where no sane pilot would venture. "That's not safe," he muttered. "That's suicide." Jara shook her head, her voice sharpening despite her exhaustion. "They won't follow. Too dangerous." Eli rubbed his temples, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "All right, assuming we don't get crushed, what's the plan once we're there?" Jara hesitated, her expression unreadable. "Hide. Repair. Wait." Eli snorted. Great plan. Really solid. But he had no better options. With a resigned sigh, he adjusted the ship's trajectory. "Buckle up, alien. This is going to be rough." The ship creaked and groaned as Eli guided it deeper into the asteroid field. The rocks grew larger and more erratic, some spinning wildly, others locked in slow, ominous rotations. Jara gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles pale against her silvery skin. Every lurch of the ship sent a jolt of pain through her body, but she didn't complain. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. "Why? Help?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the tense silence. Eli glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Why not? You needed it." Jara's eyes narrowed. "Humans don't help. Not like this." Eli chuckled dryly. "Maybe not the ones you've met, but I'm not exactly a by-the-book kind of guy." The ship jolted violently as a smaller asteroid grazed its hull. Alarms blared, and Eli cursed under his breath, gripping the controls tighter. "This is insane," he muttered. "You better be right about this place." Jara didn't respond. Her focus was elsewhere, her mind racing through fragments of memories and old Lara's teachings. There was something about this part of the asteroid field, something she remembered from her childhood. Her people called it the Shadow's Veil, a natural labyrinth that disrupted scanners and hid even the faintest life signatures. It was dangerous, but it was their best chance. As the ship approached the unmarked location, the air grew tense. The asteroids were massive here, some so large they cast shadows across the ship, plunging them into brief moments of darkness. Eli's hands were steady on the controls, but his jaw was clenched tight. "Almost there," he muttered. "Whatever there is." Jara's gaze was fixed on the viewport. She felt it before she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. "Stop," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. "Here." Eli frowned but obeyed, cutting the thrusters and letting the ship drift. He turned to Jara, his expression skeptical. "What now?" Jara pointed to a cluster of asteroids ahead. They were tightly packed, their surfaces covered in jagged ridges and strange, crystalline growths. Between those, hidden. Eli raised an eyebrow. "You're kidding." "No," Jara said firmly. "Trust." Eli sighed, muttering something under his breath about how trusting strangers in life-or-death situations was becoming a bad habit. But he guided the ship into the narrow gap between the asteroids, his nerves on edge. As they slipped into the hidden pocket, the ship's systems flickered, and the radar went dark. Eli's eyes widened. "What the?" Jara placed a hand on the console, her expression calm. "Field. Blocks signals. Safe." Eli let out a shaky breath, leaning back in his chair. "Safe. Right. Until we run out of air." Jara didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were distant, her thoughts elsewhere. She was already calculating their next move, thinking about how to repair the ship and how to survive the hunter's inevitable return. But for now, they had a moment of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to breathe, to hope. And in the cold, dark expanse of space, sometimes hope was all they had. Shelter in the shadows. Eli's ship floated in eerie silence, nestled deep within the asteroid cluster's jagged embrace. The scanners were dead, blinded by the strange crystalline formations that surrounded them. The only light came from the faint glow of Jera's pale skin, reflecting off the dim cabin walls. Eli stared at her, still trying to understand how he had gone from a quiet cargo run to hiding in a galactic graveyard with an alien fugitive. "This place gives me the creeps," Eli muttered, glancing at the viewport. The asteroids outside seemed alive, shifting and rotating in slow, unpredictable patterns. "Are you sure this is safe?" Jera, seated cross-legged on the floor, opened her eyes. "Safe, for now," she replied. Her voice was steadier than before, but her exhaustion was evident. "Hunters fear this place." Eli leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Why? What's so special about it?" Jera hesitated, as if debating how much to share. "This was ours. My people hid here, long ago." Eli's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, you're saying your people lived here, in the middle of this mess?" Jera nodded. "Not live. Survive. The hunters, they destroyed much of us. This place, last refuge." But her voice trailed off, and her gaze darkened. "Not safe forever." Eli exhaled slowly, his curiosity piqued. He pulled up a schematic of the ship's systems, noting the damage they'd taken during the chase. "Well, if your people survived here before, maybe there's something useful left behind. We need parts, repairs, and some idea of how to get out of this mess." Jera's expression hardened. "The past, not kind. What's left here will not welcome us." Eli smirked, grabbing a toolkit from under the console. "Story of my life. Let's see what's out there." The ship's airlock hissed open, and Eli stepped onto the surface of the nearest asteroid, his boots crunching against its crystalline surface. Jera followed closely, her steps hesitant. The air around them felt heavy, almost oppressive, despite the lack of atmosphere. The strange crystals emitted a faint hum, vibrating just enough to send shivers down Eli's spine. "You sure this is a good idea?" Eli asked, glancing at Jera. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes scanning the landscape. Then she pointed to a distant structure, a massive spire of dark metal embedded in the asteroid. Its surface was covered in alien symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "There," Jera said. "Old station. Maybe help." Eli's jaw tightened. Maybe help, or maybe more trouble. "Both," Jera admitted, her voice soft. The journey to the spire was tense. The path wound through narrow canyons of jagged rock, and the crystals seemed to hum louder with every step. Eli kept his hand on his sidearm, his senses on high alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they approached the spire, its massive doors loomed over them. They were intricately carved with alien patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Jera stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the symbols. The door responded instantly, sliding open with a low, resonant rumble. Eli blinked. "Okay, that's creepy. Does everything your people make look like it's alive?" Jera ignored him, stepping inside. The interior of the spire was dimly lit, the walls covered in the same shifting patterns. Dust and debris littered the floor, evidence of a long-abandoned station. But the air here felt different, charged with energy. "Power source still active," Jera observed, her voice tinged with both hope and caution. "Good and bad." Eli frowned. "Why bad?" Jera hesitated, her gaze fixed on the shadows that stretched across the room. "Not empty." The words had barely left her mouth when a sharp metallic screech echoed through the chamber. Eli spun around, his hand instinctively drawing his pistol. From the darkness, a spider-like drone emerged, its legs clicking against the floor as its glowing red eyes locked onto them. "Friend of yours?" Eli asked, backing up toward Jera. "Defense system," Jera said grimly. "Protects the station." "Fantastic," Eli muttered. "Let me guess, it's not going to listen if we say we're just passing through." Jera shook her head. "No. The drone lunged, its metallic legs slicing through the air with deadly precision. Eli fired, the shot ricocheting off the drone's armored exterior. Great. Of course, it's bulletproof. Zara darted to a nearby console, her hands flying across the controls. "Buy time," she said, her voice tense. "Buy time." Eli shouted, ducking as the drone's leg narrowly missed his head. "Sure, no problem. I'll just wrestle this thing until you're ready." Zara didn't respond, her focus entirely on the console. Her fingers danced over the alien interface, activating dormant systems. Lights flickered on, illuminating more of the chamber. Finally, with a sharp intake of breath, she found what she was looking for. "Now," Zara shouted. Eli dove out of the way as the drone froze mid-strike. A loud hum filled the room, and the drone collapsed, its limbs twitching before falling still. Eli lay on the ground, panting. "You could have mentioned that sooner." Zara offered a faint smile, helping him to his feet. "You? Fast." "Yeah, well," Eli said, brushing himself off. "Let's hope there's something here worth all this trouble." As they explored deeper into the station, Zara's unease grew. The place held memories of her people's last stand, their desperate fight for survival. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a graveyard. But hidden among the ruins, something stirred. Something old. Something powerful. And as they delved further, both Eli and Zara realized that the greatest danger might not come from the hunters, but from the ghosts of Zara's past. The final stand. The station's once quiet halls were alive with chaos. Lights flickered erratically, casting sharp shadows across the metallic walls. Alarms wailed, their piercing tones blending with the distant roar of approaching engines. The hunters had found them. Eli sprinted down a narrow corridor, his boots echoing against the floor. Behind him, Zara struggled to keep up, clutching a strange device she had salvaged from the station. Its alien design glowed faintly, pulsing with energy that seemed almost alive. "They're here," Eli shouted over the noise. "How did they find us so fast?" Zara's voice was steady, though her breath was ragged. "The station sent a signal. Old defense system. It called them." Eli groaned. "Fantastic. So the place we're hiding is also an alien beacon. Great planning." Ahead, the corridor opened into a massive chamber. It was unlike anything Eli had seen before. The room was circular, its walls lined with glowing symbols that pulsed in time with the device Zara carried. At the center stood a towering structure, a crystalline core encased in a network of wires and conduits. Energy radiated from it, filling the air with a low hum that made the hair on the back of Eli's neck stand up. Zara stumbled toward the core, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and dread. "This weapon, last hope." Eli followed, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Weapon? Please tell me it's something we can actually use." Zara nodded, her fingers brushing against the crystalline surface. "Powerful, but unstable. Dangerous." "Great," Eli muttered, setting down his pack and pulling out his tools. "Dangerous and unstable. Sounds like my kind of party." Zara didn't smile. Her focus was entirely on the core. She placed the device she had been carrying into a slot at its base, and the entire room seemed to shudder. The glowing symbols on the walls brightened, and the hum of energy grew louder. "What are you doing?" Eli asked, his voice rising as the ground beneath them trembled. "Activating it," Zara said simply. Eli's eyes widened. "Activating it? You don't even know if it still works." Zara turned to him, her expression grim. "If we don't try, we die." Before Eli could argue, the station shook violently. The sound of metal screeching against metal filled the air, followed by a deafening explosion. The hunters had breached the outer defenses. Time was running out. Eli grabbed his pistol, his heart pounding. "Fine. Do what you need to do. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Zara hesitated, her eyes meeting his. "You Brave. Eli smirked, though his grip on the pistol tightened. Brave, stupid, it's a thin line. He turned and ran back toward the corridor, leaving Zara to finish her work. The hunters were close now, their heavy footsteps echoing through the halls. Eli ducked behind a support beam, peering out just as the first of them entered the chamber. They were tall, their bodies encased in sleek, black armor that seemed to ripple like liquid. Their weapons glowed with a sickly green light, and their movements were unnervingly precise. Eli's stomach churned. These weren't just soldiers, they were predators. "All right," Eli muttered to himself, taking aim. "Let's see if you bleed." He fired, the shot striking one of the hunters square in the chest. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it turned its glowing eyes toward him, a low growl emanating from its throat. Of course, Eli groaned, ducking as the hunter fired back. The beam scorched the wall inches from his head, leaving a smoking crater. Back in the core chamber, Zara worked furiously, her hands moving over the alien console with practiced precision. The weapons systems were ancient, their interface sluggish and unpredictable. But she couldn't stop. Every second counted. The core began to glow brighter, its energy building to dangerous levels. Zara's fingers hesitated over the final command. Once she activated the weapon, there would be no turning back. The station would unleash its full power, but it would likely destroy itself in the process, and them with it. "Eli," she called, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Almost ready." Eli's voice came back, strained but defiant. "Take your time. I'm only fighting for my life here." He fired again, this time hitting the lead hunter's weapon. It exploded in a shower of sparks, and the creature snarled, lunging toward him with terrifying speed. Eli barely managed to roll out of the way, his heart hammering in his chest. "Any day now, Zara," he shouted. Zara took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the final command. "Hold. On." She pressed the panel, and the room erupted in light. The core's energy surged outward, the symbols on the walls blazing like fire. A deep, resonant hum filled the station, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Eli staggered back as the hunters froze, their bodies convulsing as the weapon's energy overwhelmed them. The air crackled with electricity, and the entire station shook violently. Eli ran back toward the core chamber, dodging falling debris. "Zara," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the noise. "What did you do?" Zara stood at the console, her face pale but resolute. "It's over." The core reached its peak, and a blinding wave of energy swept through the station. The hunters disintegrated, their forms dissolving into ash. The station groaned one final time before the core imploded, the energy collapsing in on itself. Eli grabbed Zara, pulling her toward the escape pod they had spotted earlier. The two of them dove inside just as the station began to collapse. The pod launched, propelling them away from the explosion. Through the viewport, Eli watched as the station was consumed by fire and light, disappearing into the void. As the pod drifted in the silence of space, Eli turned to Zara, his breath ragged. "Well," he said, his voice shaky but light, "that was one hell of a gamble." Zara managed a faint smile. "Alive. That is enough." For now, it was. But Eli knew this wasn't the end. The galaxy had a way of throwing curveballs, and with Zara by his side, he suspected things were only going to get more interesting. Hope beyond survival. The escape pod floated silently in the void, far from the remnants of the station. Inside, the faint hum of the life support system was the only sound. Eli leaned back against the pod's curved wall, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. His body ached, his mind raced. But they were alive. Somehow, they had survived. Across from him, Zara sat quietly, her silvery blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light. She held the remnants of the alien device she had used to activate the station's weapon. The glow was gone, the energy drained, but she clutched it as if it were a lifeline. Eli opened one eye and looked at her. "So," he said, his voice rough but steady, "that went better than expected." Zara tilted her head, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Better is relative." Eli chuckled, the sound dry and low. "Fair point." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their escape settling over them. Then Eli leaned forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, not to ruin the moment, but we've got a bit of a problem." Zara raised an eyebrow. "Problem?" Eli gestured around the pod. "This thing isn't exactly built for long journeys. Supplies are limited, and we're drifting in the middle of nowhere. Unless you've got a secret stash of snacks, we're going to need help." Zara frowned, her gaze drifting to the viewport. The endless expanse of space stretched out before them, vast and unyielding. "Signal," she said after a moment. "Distress. Someone. We'll hear." Eli nodded, already working on it. He leaned over the pod's console, flipping switches and adjusting dials. A faint static crackled through the speakers, followed by a weak transmission. "Mayday, Mayday," Eli said into the microphone. "This is Captain Eli Carter. Ship destroyed. Escape pod active. Requesting assistance. Over." The static continued, unbroken. Eli sighed, slumping back against the wall. "Guess we're not exactly in a busy neighborhood." Zara's eyes remained fixed on the viewport. "They will come," she said softly. "Human or Laris? Someone." Eli looked at her, his brow furrowing. "You really believe that?" Zara met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Yes. Hope is powerful." Eli smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You're full of surprises, you know that." Before Zara could respond, the pod shuddered slightly. Eli sat up straight, his hand instinctively reaching for the console. "What was that?" Zara's eyes narrowed. "Ship." Eli quickly activated the external sensors. The display flickered to life, revealing a large vessel approaching from the darkness. Its design was unfamiliar, sleek, and angular, with glowing blue accents that pulsed rhythmically. "That doesn't look like one of ours," Eli muttered. Zara leaned closer to the screen, her eyes widening. "Laris," she whispered. Eli's jaw tightened. "Friends of yours, or—" "Not hunters," Zara said quickly, her voice filled with a mix of relief and urgency. "They." Answer signal. The vessel slowed as it neared the pod, its lights casting an ethereal glow across the small cabin. A transmission crackled through the speakers, a melodic voice speaking in Zara's native tongue. Her face softened, and for the first time, Eli saw genuine hope in her expression. "They will help," she said, turning to Eli. "They know me." Eli let out a long breath, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Well, that's a relief. For a second, I thought we were about to have round two with the hunters." The pod shuddered again, as the Laris vessel extended a docking arm. Moments later, a soft hiss signaled the connection, and the hatch opened. A group of Laris stepped inside, their features similar to Zara's but adorned with intricate markings and ceremonial attire. Zara stood, her movements still slow but steady. She exchanged a few words with the leader of the group, her tone respectful yet firm. Eli couldn't understand the language, but he recognized the gratitude in her voice. The Laris leader turned to Eli, their gaze sharp but not unkind. In broken galactic common, they said, "You helped her." Eli nodded. "Yeah, guess you could say I'm a sucker for lost causes." The Laris leader inclined their head, a gesture of respect. "Brave, human." Eli smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." As they were escorted onto the Laris ship, Eli felt a strange sense of calm. The danger wasn't entirely over. He knew that. The galaxy was still vast and unpredictable, and the hunters were still out there. But for now, they were safe. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of their journey, but the beginning of something new. Jera walked beside him, her steps surer with each passing moment. She glanced at Eli, her expression soft. "Thank you," she said simply. Eli grinned. "Don't mention it. Just promise me one thing." "What?" Jera asked. He looked ahead, his grin widening. "Next time, let's find trouble that doesn't try to blow us up." Jera laughed, a sound that was rare but genuine. "Deal." As the Luris ship powered up and disappeared into the void, the escape pod was left behind, a silent witness to their survival. But in its wake, it carried a message, a beacon of hope in the endless dark.